All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our next lesson, which is kind of a combination of two different lessons. We're going to talk about stratospheric ozone depletion, which you may have heard referred to as a hole in the ozone layer. And then we're going to talk about how we've reduced ozone depletion over time. So, first, a quick reminder that ozone can exist in two distinct layers of the atmosphere, and depending on where it is, it can be either harmful or it can be beneficial. So, this is a graph showing showing the concentration of ozone versus the altitude. So, as you go higher on this graph on the x sorry y-axis, you're going to be higher above the earth's surface. So notice closest to the earth's surface in the troposphere, the ozone that's there is an air pollutant. It is a local air pollutant and it is bad ozone. So remember, in the troposphere, ozone is bad. But higher above the earth's surface in the layer called the stratosphere, you have beneficial ozone. And we're going to talk about why that ozone is beneficial and kind of what we've been doing to it. So notice around here, you have kind of the peak concentration of the ozone in the stratosphere, and it's at about 25 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Up there, nobody is up there to breathe ozone. There aren't any organisms living up there. If there are only maybe some scattered bacteria floating, maybe. And so there's not really anything to be harmed up there by ozone. And it does a very important service for us, which we'll talk about in a minute. Before we can talk about why ozone is so beneficial in the ozone layer, we have to talk about what it's blocking, which is UV radiation. This is ultraviolet radiation, and it's high energy radiation coming in from the sun. When it hits cells, it can mutate their DNA, and hopefully you have learned by now or remember that mutations in DNA most often cause cancer. So, when you have exposure in humans, for example, to ultraviolet radiation, it causes mutations in skin cells, and that causes skin cancer. One of the particularly bad forms of skin cancer, called melanoma, is often caused by UV radiation exposure. Melanoma is a very aggressive cancer, which is why it's dangerous. A lot of times, by the time you've detected it, it's become very difficult to treat, and it has a high mortality rate. So, UV radiation makes up about 10% of what we're getting on Earth from the sun. There are three main types. We divide them up based on how much energy they have. So, there's UVA, which has the lowest energy and is the least harmful when you're exposed to it. Not to say it's not completely harmless, but it's the least harmful. UVB has medium energy and causes more harm than UVA, and UVC is the highest energy form of UV radiation and the most harmful. So that's the one that you really want to avoid exposure to. So the stratospheric ozone layer it's this thin band of renewable ozone. That's the key. It's renewable, it's self-renewing, in the lower stratosphere about 17 to 26 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And here's why it's so important. It absorbs around 99% of the harmful UV radiation coming in from the sun. What you should notice is that it is basically blocking most of the UVC. So notice here the UVC comes in and it gets stopped by the ozone layer. And it's blocking a lot of the UVB. So about this much of it gets through, and then this much of it gets blocked. So it's blocking about 99% of what's most harmful coming in. And without the ozone layer, life would have been had trouble evolving on Earth, and life could not continue to exist on the surface of the Earth without ozone. If the ozone layer suddenly disappeared, the only things that would be living that could survive this would be maybe underground or under the water, because those are the only ways to block UV radiation aside from the ozone layer. So, how does this stuff form? Well, what happens is UV radiation will strike an oxygen atom in the upper atmosphere, and it will cause it to split into two free oxygen atoms. Then that free oxygen atom will go on to hit an oxygen molecule. So that'll be O minus plus O2, and that's going to make ozone, O3. Then what happens also is sometimes UV radiation hits an ozone molecule. When it does, it splits that ozone molecule into a free oxygen molecule and then an oxygen atom. And these free oxygen atoms are very reactive. So that oxygen atom can then hit another ozone molecule, and that forms two molecules of oxygen. Then that oxygen can go on to be hit by other UV rays, and this process can just happen over and over again, recycling the same few atoms of oxygen. So, this is why ozone is renewable. It is kind of created by the very thing it's blocking, and it's without any interference from humans or any natural processes, though there are very few that natural processes that can affect the ozone layer. Without that, ozone is self-renewing. As long as there's enough oxygen in the atmosphere, we've got an ozone layer. But as you can guess, since we're talking about this, humans have messed some stuff up. So, what we noticed in about 1984 is that the ozone layer was thinning, especially over Antarctica. So, this graph is showing you they call it the hole in the ozone layer. It's not really a hole, it's more of a thinning. And so it is here. This is Antarctica. And notice that this is a graph showing the total ozone, and the darker purple the colors, the lower the ozone. If it's kind of reddish, that means higher levels of ozone. So back in 1979, they started collecting this data from like 1970. And so they started seeing a thinning of the ozone layer. And then in 1987, this thinning was very, very dramatic. It's lasted all the way through 2006, 2011, though there were some signs recently that the ozone layer is starting to recover and that concentrations of ozone are increasing. So, how did this how what was our response to this, or how did this happen? My bad. This was because humans were releasing ozone depleting chemicals. We release them into the troposphere, they drift up into the stratosphere, and then UV radiation hits them, causes a highly reactive chlorine atom to get released. That chlorine atom then can hit an ozone molecule and strip off one of the oxygens. After it strips off an oxygen, it basically gets released from that oxygen. Um, and then you have it can react with another free oxygen to form an O2 molecule and chlorine. So notice this is all starting because chlorine is reacting with ozone. So it decreases the concentration of ozone in the stratosphere, which makes it much harder for the concentrations to decrease, remain the same. The most common or the most well-known ozone depleting chemical are chlorofluorocarbons. They're a class of chemicals that, like what you see here, they have chlorines, they have fluorines, and they have carbon. Not very creative on the naming. These served as coolants in refrigerators and air conditioners. They were also propellants for aerosol cans. So, for example, if you had a can of something and then you sprayed, for example, hairspray was a big culprit. The stuff that helps propel or move that spray out of the can, back in the day, those used to be CFCs. And one of the reasons why CFCs are so dangerous is because it takes a while for them to leave the stratosphere. So they can stay up there for 65 to 385 years. That's also why, even though we've been taking steps to reduce the thinning of the ozone for decades, it still hasn't. The problem hasn't been fixed because there are CFCs up there that have been up there for decades and will be up there for decades to come. and each individual chlorine molecule can break down like 10,000 ozone molecules before it ends up no longer being a problem, like reacting with something permanently. You may ask yourself, well, why is all this happening mostly over Antarctica? And there are a couple of explanations. One of which is that in the winter, there are ice crystals that form in the Antarctic air and clouds and so on. When those melt, that's going to help increase ozone depletion. And here's how. So ice crystals form during the winter and then they collect CFCs on their surface. They also speed up the reactions that release the chlorine, but they don't let them mix with the ozone in the stratosphere. So they start building up. Then when the ice melts in the spring, and you've had all these chlorine atoms that were just kind of chilling on the ice, then a lot of it's released at once, and within a few weeks, about 40 to 50% of the ozone above Antarctica ends up being broken down. So I have two diagrams here because I kind of liked both of them for different reasons. This is kind of giving you specifics that ice particles speed up the release of chlorine, and it also prevents certain chemicals from neutralizing that chlorine. So it works both ways. It makes sure there's more chlorine around and it prevents that chlorine from being taken up. Then I like this diagram because it's very simple. It just shows you there are winter ice crystals, CFCs, which are these little purple spheres, build up around the ice crystals, and then UV light breaks down releases the chlorine, and then once it warms in the spring, you're gonna have these ice crystals melting, releasing a lot of chlorine that's going to destroy a lot of ozone in a very quick time frame. So why should we care? Well, when you have stratospheric ozone depletion, that lets more UV rays reach the Earth's surface, which can have a number of impacts. So the human health impacts include an increase in skin cancer as well as cataracts. Cataracts are kind of a filmy layer in the eye that helps block your vision. It can also decrease immune system function. And then there are the environmental impacts. So it really damages plants, UV radiation. So it decreases their productivity, meaning you're going to have less food for the food chain and you're going to be producing less oxygen. And this happens in forests. This also happens in the ocean. So when you have phytoplankton, which are those photosynthesizing little bitty creatures in the ocean, the surface phytoplankton will also be damaged and have a lower productivity. Also, keep in mind, we grow plants for a reason, and these plants are damaged by UV radiation exposure, so that will decrease crop yields. Also, remember UV light helps to create photochemical smog. So, when you have more UV light reaching into the troposphere, then you're going to have an increase in the amount of photochemical smog formed and all the associated negative impacts of that. So, how do we reduce ozone depletion? Well, it took a good decade or so for the scientists responsible for discovering this to really kind of bring attention to the problem and um, kind of jolt people into acting. And so in 1987, about 175 nations met in Canada, in Montreal, and agreed to the Montreal Protocol on Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer. This was an agreement by all these nations to reduce the emissions of these ozone depleting chemicals. And it was a wild success because between then and now, the global emissions of these ozone depleting chemicals has decreased by about 99%. So here on this graph, you see a number of different chemicals that are ozone depleting chemicals, and you see the concentrations of them over time from about 1986, right before the Montreal Protocol, all the way up to 2021. There was a bit of a peak after the Montreal Protocol because the amounts of these being used was still increasing, but companies were searching for alternatives at that point to these ozone depleting chemicals. So how did we do this? Well, a lot of the companies that were producing a lot of the ozone depleting chemicals were forced to look for alternative chemicals that could do the same function. So, for example, replacing CFCs in refrigerators with less harmful chemicals, those that wouldn't deplete the ozone layer. This graph is showing you uh, the measurements in 1971 and 2017 of the ozone concentration above Antarctica. Notice it was much higher in 1971. It reached its lowest level in about the year 2000. And then 2041 and 2065 are projections based on the current trend of the increase in the amount of ozone. So notice by 2065 that thinning of the ozone layer will be dramatically decreased. Um, and it's thought that by about 2100, the levels of ozone in Antarctica should reach the levels they used to be in, say, like 1950. So, what are some of the chemicals that have been used to replace CFCs? There are hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs. Notice no chlorine in there. The big problem, though, is some of these replacements are strong greenhouse gases, so we're ultimately going to have to find replacements for those. I will point out that this is going to be one of our environmental success stories that we'll be able to look at, feel a little good about ourselves as humans, and we're going to contrast that to the global response to climate change, which is going to be our next topic. So, air hugs towards you and towards the air itself. And I'll see you for our next lesson.